Welcome again to the Real Bible Rob podcast. Today, I get to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and uh, is Calvinism. And I am Presbyterian, and Presbyterians come from a Calvinist theology, Reform theology. So I'll kind of talk about what's the difference between what people think of Calvinism, who Calvin was, and Reformed theology. There actually is quite a bit of difference, more than people realize, and talk a little bit about that history and mostly how people use Calvinism and where that comes from. So I hope that it's enlightening for you, because I think that my journey through the process of coming to grips with what it means to be reformed, um, it can really kind of show that there isn't just one thing. It isn't exactly what you hear about, especially in media and especially in fundamentalist churches where they have a very particular kind of Calvinism. So I will talk about that, and I'll start with a little bit of a story. Uh, First is that I put up a video on TikTok, Instagram, my usual platforms about 2.5 years ago now. And I said, Calvinism is controlling. And I referred to the RC Sproul quote. So if you're familiar with RC Sproul, very prominent uh, uh, Calvinist, Reformed theology person he wrote a lot of books. He was on in media during the mid to late 20th century. So anyway, and R.C. Sproul is a smart guy and has said a lot of things. So anyway, but he made a statement that's often quoted, and it says, "If there is one single molecule in this universe running around loose, totally free of God's sovereignty, then we have no guarantee that a single promise of God will ever be fulfilled." Wow, what a strong statement, filled with a lot of theology. And so I mentioned that. I said it's kind of it's revealing, and I think it reveals a lot about the controlling nature of Calvinism as it's practiced nowadays. So anyway, when I was a young person, I was, really into religion in the 1970s when I was growing up, especially as a young teenager. Like a lot of young teenagers are, a lot of people, when they start discovering faith for themselves, they kind of have to they struggle through that. Not everybody does that, but a lot of people do. So I was kind of your typical thoughtful teenager trying to figure all of this stuff out. And I grew up in a quite conservative, I would not call it necessarily fundamentalist, because it still was at the time part of the mainline Presbyterian Church. No longer is. They left the denomination. But back in the 1970s, a church that had 2,500 or so members, pretty large, pretty prominent. And I heard a lot about theology naturally, and I grew up in that church, and that's how I was formed. And so this was in a very important time in religious history, and that was in the mid 1970s. I had no idea at the time. Things like the women's rights were big. Civil rights had happened in the 1960s. People were really changing. The Jesus movement, the hippies, all of that had happened. Then, distrust of government from Watergate, all of those things had happened. And one of the big watersheds in that period was that Jimmy Carter got elected in 1976. And you would think, wow, well, the evangelicals won, right? Because Jimmy Carter is probably the most religious president we ever had. And he was a Southern Baptist. So he came from a pretty conservative, theologically conservative background. And here he won. So a lot of people in church world were excited about Jimmy Carter. And That didn't last long, and there's a lot of reasons for it. But in 1977, he, you know, he was given the benefit of the doubt, and things were really kind of rocking and it was part of the zeitgeist of that period because you have to remember that there was really a big Jesus movement starting. It's starting when you start hearing about the beginnings of the evangelical megachurch movement. Kind of started then, more in the 80s, and there was a lot of response to that. One of the things that happened when I was in 1977 was that I met Francis Schaeffer. I was a teenager and went to a book signing that happened at my church. My church was, like I said, pretty large, Trinity United Presbyterian Church in Santa Ana, California, and they hosted um, pretty conservative, well-known authors and stuff like that for things like book signings and talks. And Francis Schaeffer came to that. I had no idea at the time that I was witnessing history in this, and that this would blossom. That Schaeffer was a major figure in the rise of the moral majority and the Christian right. He gave intellectual heft to that movement that other leaders at the time, people like Jerry Falwell or Paul Weyrich and those type of people, they could not give to that. You needed a Francis Schaeffer who was a real theologian and very, very knowledgeable to do that. And he wrote a book called How Then Shall We Live? And it is basically a Calvinist tome, and pushes kind of a pretty conservative, RC Sproul type view of religion, of theology, and it was the beginning of a pretty full-on attack of the liberal order, and that you begin to see that then, and of course now we see very much that kind of attack on that. But it was very prominent then. I remember lots of people in the church talking about, as Carter showed that he was not going to toe the line, the evangelical line, later in his presidency, people started calling him a Marxist and started using the typical ways of maligning him in that movement. And of course, with Reagan, who was probably one of the least religious presidents we've ever had, but he became an avatar for the religious right movement, and he kowtowed to them, and as a result, became that. So that's sort of the history behind that. What did I learn from this? I learned that the Calvinism I grew up with was different and was changing. And so when people ask, well, how's your relationship with Jesus? Whenever they ask me that, I go, it's pretty good. It's growing. I'm learning. Never better, really. How about that Calvin guy? Not so much. And I'll tell you why. The thing that happened, especially as I grew in the faith, and definitely as I went to seminary and started interacting a lot more with Reformed people from other traditions other than my PC USA, Presbyterian Church USA world, is I started hearing a lot about TULIP, and I started hearing about the Christian Reformed Church and the Covenant Church and the Presbyterian Church of America in America. The OPC, I have a really good friend who was a Orthodox Presbyterian Church member for the last 20 years or so, and learned a lot from them. And they always talked about TULIP. I go, what the heck is TULIP? And then there was this, of course, with the Young Restless Reformed movement, John MacArthur, John Piper, all of those people, and the rise of people like Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill, all of that, tulip, tulip, tulip. That's what I kept hearing. I go, what is this? I didn't grow up hearing this stuff. I later learned that tulip isn't really a mainline Presbyterian idea. That tulip really comes from the Dutch Reformed Church and is an acrostic that was developed to describe the 5 points of, the 5 points of Calvinism. And 5 points of Calvinism is this systematic theology that was developed out of Calvin. So Calvin's Institutes is definitely systematic theology, but um, Calvin wrote a lot, so you can almost get whatever you want out of Calvin, honestly. But kind of like Augustine, you can get a lot of stuff out of Augustine, but the church picked the parts that they needed in order to build a systematic theology that they could put into things like the Belgic Confession and the five forms of unity, the canons of Dort. The canons of Dort is basically a response to those people who weren't buying the full line of Calvin, right? So here we go. We have the Dutch Reformed movement, really what we would call hardcore Calvinists today, and they developed this acrostic called TULIP. And TULIP is total depravity, definitely from Augustine, right? This idea that humanity is completely deprived on the way to hell. uh, Unconditional election. Aha, the elect, that God selects people to be the elect. Limited atonement, how atonement is provided. And then once how the atonement's provided by through the sacrifice of Jesus for the elect in this world, irresistible grace is you can't resist it. You don't have a choice. Basically, predestination, right? And then the perseverance of the saints. So you see that? TULIP, TULIP. And perseverance of the saints is the idea that once you become or once you're saved, you're always saved, essentially. That you can't lose your salvation when you're when you're in the elect. Now, naturally, what comes out of this is the idea of reprobates, the non-elect, the people who are destined to hell. And those people were selected by God too. So a lot of people have resisted this over the centuries. They've said, oh, well, I'm a 5 point Calvinist. I'm all in. I totally go for it. And then there are 4 point Calvinists that tend to not think of limited atonement. They tend to reject limited atonement. And they say, well, maybe I'm not into double predestination, they call it. This is the idea that there's elect and then there's reprobates, and there's no way to get, be one or the other, or anything other than one or the other. And uh, some people have modified that. Calvinists are very inventive in how they deal with things like, oh, what about children when they die? What about accepting Christ? What about um, uh, repentance? What about determinism? Things like that. Well, anyway, some people deal with that by going 4 points, by getting rid of or downplaying limited atonement. Uh, I've joked sometimes that I'm a 1 point Calvinist, and that is the perseverance of the saints. Once you're saved, you're good. But anyway, I'm not sure that really fits. But the idea is that this is a systematic theology that was developed in response to people, in response to Calvin, couple generations after Calvin. And then also in response to the people who were starting to take on Calvinism, like the Presbyterians, John Knox, and then even the Anglican Church started taking on some of these Calvin theologies. Well, in Holland, in the Dutch Reformed Church and associated were resisting that and saying, no, we have a more pure version. You've heard the words Puritan, right? You've heard of that. Came to America too. 100 years later in America, very, very, I should say, less than 100 years because it was through the 17th century, but it really came into flower with Jonathan Edwards in the what was called the First Great Awakening period, and um, with hardcore Puritan exclusive. Never get the idea that the Puritans in New England were in for religious liberty. That's complete nonsense. They were in to make a theocracy. Uh, that was Jonathan Edwards and that whole group of people. They were trying to make a theocracy in America. Very utopian. Anyway, so that's where that comes from. And that's where a lot of these ideas about Calvinism got hardcore. When you get to more mainstream, things like the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is Anglican in origin. Don't ever get the idea that Westminster Confession of Faith is a hardcore Calvinist thing. Nope, it's Anglican. It's a came from uh, an act of Parliament, and the Anglicans got the Presbyterians on board with it essentially by toning it down a little bit. There's not having double predestination, having more language about free will and stuff like that built into it. So uh, that's sort of some of the history where this comes from and why you have these multiple strains of Calvinism. And then I'll talk a little bit about what happened in the modern era in a second. But first, let's talk about where does Calvinism work? What did Calvin get right? Um, you always have to remember where Calvin came from. The Reformation, basically started by Luther. You could say that not Calvin's responding a little bit to Luther, but the strains were happening in multiple areas. Luther was maybe the first one to really, oppose the Catholic Church in a way that, with the 95 Theses and so forth, in a way that was, right in the Catholic Church's face. But there was a lot of discontent throughout Europe about the lack of purity, essentially, theological purity in the Catholic Church, and their response to it. Uh, Things about like indulgences and the corruptions in the church. So Calvin uh, is he's in Switzerland and he in Geneva area, and he is kind of a compromise. You could say he's kind of a little bit more middle of the road between Luther, who definitely wants to stay, he wants the uh, Catholic Church to uh, reform. He doesn't want to leave the Catholic Church. And it turns out that later on, even though it was impossible for him to reconcile with the Catholic Church, Lutheranism contained tons of Catholic theology, and even today, Lutheranism has a lot of Catholic ideas in it. And then you have the Anabaptists and Zwingli and those guys who were completely rejectionists. Well, Calvin's more of a middle of the road, and I've talked about that before. What Calvin was trying to do with his theology is he was taking on the parts of Catholicism that made sense to him in a systematic way. So we're talking about Augustine, and then moving into Thomas Aquinas. And he's built, but instead of the system being based on the sacraments, he makes it so that it's based on belief and based on grace, only by grace. Some people have used, the solas, the idea of the solas and so forth, and that does fit with Calvinism. But the idea that instead of saying that he's trying to build one reality that that makes sense. He's trying to unify various strains of thought into one theology that makes sense and that is that is well thought out and airtight. That was really his goal. And if you look at the institutes, you can see that step by step, and he modified it over and over again. But really, by I think it's 1538 approximately, he pretty much had that together. He started doing the commentaries, and you can see the commentaries. Calvin's commentaries are an application of this kind of theology and trying to pull that together. That's what theology always is, right? It's never it doesn't come out of Scripture directly. It's always taking scriptures and putting them together in a way to support a theology. And that's what Calvin did, and he did it very successfully. I mean, it's obvious when you look at his works, they look very familiar to us. Um, Even though they were written 500 years ago, they look really familiar to us because we've adopted so much of his thought into our worldview and into our theologies. That's part of it. The other reason is he's just a genius. Uh, they are incredible. But you always have to remember that Calvinism, so that's what he got right. He basically created a system of theology that could live beyond the authority of the Pope and the authority of the church hierarchy, that that could be basically useful, right, for Protestants. The problem came, and then again, is in how it was used. You have to remember that Calvin was writing before Galileo, before the scientific revolution. Calvin was writing before uh, the full flowering of the Enlightenment. Calvin had no concept of anything to do with democracy, for example, really. Calvin also had a very Eurocentric point of view. Obviously, he's a European. Um, Calvin definitely did know Greek and knew it well. He knew Hebrew somewhat. The most indications are is that he didn't know Hebrew very much, but he did know it enough, and he definitely brings it up in his commentaries. He also, but you also have to remember, he didn't know that much about Judaism. So you know Hebrew, but he didn't know that much about Judaism as practiced. So that's his view. Remember, so he comes in from that point of view, definitely before science. So his idea is he is carrying the idea of the time about determinism and absolutely, what was called divine determinism. In other words, that God controls everything. And this comes from that period because that was the only thing that we knew. Isaac Newton was a determinist, right? What is determinism? Determinism is that if you know everything about what goes into a process or a system, then you'll be able to predict every outcome. That's determinism. Everything is determined. The idea of predestination is determinism, that it was determined before it would happen. And like I said, Isaac Newton was that way. That's how Isaac Newton built up this idea that what I see happening here on Earth, an apple falling to the ground, that gravity, that also applies to the planets and the stars and stuff like that out there. So the action that happens here also happens out there. And why? Because if I know everything, and I'm able to build a system that works universally for everything. Very Calvinist idea, right? It's really a watershed. It's the basis for a lot of the knowledge that we have is this idea of determinism. And you can look at it in Calvin's theology in another way too, is that Calvin was just, whenever he ran into a logical roadblock, and he ran into many of them, but, especially about things like, how can a loving God, condemn people to hell, for example? And how can, uh, how can you resolve things like free will and sovereignty, absolute what they call meticulous sovereignty? How can you resolve those things? Well, a lot of times when Calvin ran into a logical roadblock, I shouldn't say a lot of times, all the time, every time he always said, is because I have limited knowledge. We don't know. We don't know because our brains are so small and God is so sovereign and big and huge. And so he always gave himself a little trap door. And it's just saying, well, you can determine everything. because God controls everything. Like R.C. Sproul said, every little molecule in the whole universe is governed by God's sovereignty and providence. So therefore, um, you know, uh, since that's the maxim, or that's the axiom that says everything's determined. So if we don't know it or we can't understand it, it's just because we're limited. And now you think about that. You talk to most Christians today, you talk to most people today in Western societies, they believe that 100%, right? we it's because of our lack of understanding that we can't determine an outcome. Well, the system breaks apart though, because as we did learn more about science, as we did learn, especially in the 20th century, about uncertainty, the uncertainty principle, um, and the chaos theory, things like that. By 1964, very underappreciated. There was a physicist named John Bell, Irish physicist, wrote a paper that put the last nail in the coffin of determinism. The idea is that uh, you can't determine. It's not a lack of data. It's just the way the universe is that there's uncertainty and probability. We live in a probabilistic universe, and there are many outcomes that are possible. Infinite number of outcomes that are possible, actually. So, God, obviously, if you believe that God controls every atom in the universe, then God's not following God's own creative rules. So, now there's lots of discussion about how you can deal with that. But you can see that the idea of um, determinism, or what's called divine determinism, is central to Calvinism. So I actually reference a couple of books here in the notes, and one of them is by a really great theologian named Roger E. Olson. Roger Olson is a Arminian. I think he's Methodist, but Wesleyan background, and he wrote a book called Against Calvinism, and he cooperated with a firm conservative 5-point Calvinist named Michael Scott Horton, who wrote a companion book called For Calvinism. For Calvinism, was very familiar to me, and I don't buy it, a lot of it. But anyway, uh, Olson's book, Against Calvinism, talks a lot about determinism, and he talks about it, and he basically kind of rips the band-aid off of the Calvinist idea of absolute control and dealing with free will, and how that they don't fit together. He kind of he does a really effective job of that. And so he kind of shows how the system breakdown happens. And so one of the ways, so I mentioned that divine or determinism just isn't a principle of physics anymore, or of life, or of reality anymore. It doesn't make any sense. And so what comes out of this is this idea of meticulous providence. So what the R.C. Sproul quote about control of every molecule in the universe, that's something called meticulous sovereignty or meticulous providence. Providence meaning looking forward, sovereignty, absolute control. So Calvinism is controlling because Calvinism believes in a 100% absolute controlling God. And that God, if something happens, it's by God's choice, whether by commission or omission. It's always God's choice because God controls every molecule of the universe. So, and you can believe that. But you have to remember that that's an old idea. That's a Calvinist idea. That's a 16th century idea, a 17th century idea of determinism. And we have retained that. So when we had things like evolution come along, which is a probabilistic way of looking at life, the origin of life, and the way life goes, it didn't fit this determinism anymore. When we had things like quantum mechanics and the uncertainty principle and all of the other things that we've learned about in mathematics, for example, about chaos and so forth, doesn't fit determinism anymore. So you have a choice. Well, I would even say things like democracy, like social things, where you rely on that. Essentially, democracy is the crowdsourcing of, of rule, of the people, and it's messy and it's not. You don't know what the outcome's going to be. You don't know what the outcome of an election's going to be. Non-deterministic. When you're faced with that, which in the 19th century people were faced with, they were starting to face with the fact that, guess what? A lot of the things the church told me aren't true. It started with Copernicus and Galileo, and it just get more and more and more that this deterministic universe, that even Isaac Newton, remember Isaac Newton was like a very, very committed churchman, and he spent the rest of his life after the initial, about gravity and optics and calculus and all of those things. He spent the rest of his life trying to basically prove God existed. He became a theologian, more or less. But the determinism didn't work anymore. When that started breaking down, you have a choice. They had a choice in the 19th century. You could either become a fundamentalist, which means you say that it isn't true. You basically kind of gaslight it and just say what you're learning in science isn't true. Evolution isn't true. And you fight it tooth and nail. Non-deterministic things like, you know, uh, probabilistic, things like more than evolution, but things like quantum mechanics and stuff like that. That's not true. That's what you start doing, or you integrate those into your faith, and you start modifying, looking at your faith differently. So that's really, 150 years ago, we started making this split. That's why we have the modernist, versus fundamentalist split in the early 20th century, the old school, new school thoughts and in Reformed theology. And then, coming, through the later 20th century, we started to do biblical studies, uh, uh, critical Bible reading, learning about that. Things like some of the old things that came out of, a lot of it came out of, feminism and civil rights that came. How do we integrate that into our faith? A lot of people have rejected those. And other people, such as my denomination and myself, integrate those. I believe that you have to reform. Church has to reform again because it got it wrong. Determinism doesn't matter. It doesn't work. So what do you do with Calvinism? Well, what you do is I think that like any theology, you take the parts forward and you reform them. People like Karl Barth, Jürgen Moltmann, uh, Reinhold Niebuhr, and a lot of those folks, who came into things like the Confession of 1967 in my denomination, started making that move toward integrating reality with religion, so that in integrating that into our theology, in reforming again. So I spoke about that earlier. Others have rejected that and pushed back really hard. I mentioned Sproul. Sproul is almost a patron saint among Presbyterian Church in America people and Reformed people who want to stick to a strict 5-point Calvinist type view. But even Sproul backed away a little bit. He hated the term divine determinism. He kind of modified and called it divine determination. He was just equivocating, basically. So he would make bold statements, which I think are incredibly arrogant, like I read, that if there's one single molecule in the universe that's running around loose, totally free of God's sovereignty, then we have no guarantee of a single promise of God ever fulfilled. Nonsense. Come on, really. How can you or me or RC Sproul sitting on a little planet, going around a medium-sized star, in a universe that's, billions and billions of light years across, ever make a statement about that? Or ever make a statement about God like that, right? Um, uh, where did he get that from? Well, he got that because he believes in determinism 100%, and he believes in divine determinism. And the only reason why we don't know everything is because we don't have enough information. And that's just not true. It doesn't comport with reality. Another person that's a big name in that Calvinist world is John Piper. And John Piper has written a lot of popular books. I don't think of John Piper really being much of a theologian himself. In other words, making new theology he's a great explainer though. He's a very good writer. So he basically takes Jonathan Edwards' theology, hook, line, and sinker, 5 point uh, um, Calvinism, hook, line, and sinker, and explains it really well for a modern audience. And he's done that. Uh, a slightly friendlier version of Piper is Keller, Tim Keller. Now, Tim Keller is beloved in Presbyterian circles and in many circles because he does have a little bit more moderate view of approach to things like political questions and how society works. But make no doubt, Tim Keller is a 5 point Calvinist. He's part of the Presbyterian Church in America, or he was before he died. He, the Gospel Coalition, and people like Mark Driscoll come out of this. Guy named Kevin DeYoung, who's basically runs the Gospel Coalition right now. Give me a break. Tim Keller is not a moderate. He never was. He was kindlier and nicer and less bombastic, maybe, but no, this is his theology too. He's the one that says, Jesus talked way more about hell than he ever did about heaven, which is not true. He talked about Gehenna, not hell. And he pushes really hard on Calvinism, essentially. So we have a lot of people that talk that way. So you have a choice. We have a choice as a Reformed church. Are we going to go down and we're just going to reject everything that we've learned in the last couple of centuries? Or are we going to integrate that into our faith? Are we going to reform again? Are we going to have a faith that doesn't deny the truth, that is able to integrate some of the great things about Calvinism and integrate them into a Reformed faith today that we can go forward with? When will we stop fighting our Arminian brethren, the people in the Wesleyan churches, which we still do? I went through ordination. I was still asked, whether uh, do I agree with Arminian things? Come on, give me a break. We are brethren. And you could say that about a lot of faiths, right? A lot of different ways of looking at soteriology, a lot of ways you can look at grace. I did a podcast all about grace, about prevenient grace, which is an Arminian concept. Why are we so hung up on this systematic theology that really is old, is dead? And why are we trying to prop up something that doesn't fit anymore? That's the way I see it. That's my opinion. So that's kind of where I see Calvinism. The Calvinism of today, the 5-point Calvinism that's driven so hard, is not from Calvin directly. It's from the reaction to those who were kind of modifying and equivocating a little bit about Calvin, even his own equivocations. The Synod, or the Synod of Dort, the Canons of Dort, Belgic Confession, are more hardline than Calvin was himself. Um, I would say that the people who, Jonathan Edwards and the Puritans, and then nowadays with Sproul and Piper and even Tim Keller, as much as you love Tim Keller, he's still part of that group. They have taken that core and they're clinging to it really hard. And I believe that the way forward, the way toward reconciliation, the way toward a more holistic faith that we can take with us and grow and have spiritual growth in, have a better, more realistic view of science, have a more realistic view of reality, have a more realistic view of the scriptures, of the Bible, and how to use them, how we can get out of the colonialist mindset, which we really still need to do. Get out of that old way of thinking and into a new, integrated, more reconciling religion. How are we going to do that? That's where we need to move forward, in my opinion. So that's how use Calvinism for what it is, for its history, for what it meant, but move forward and keep reforming. So with that, I will say, as I always do, people say lots of things about the Bible that aren't really there, especially the Calvinists. They say lots of stuff that's not in the Bible. And with that, I say, God bless you.